My father laughed at me in front of 40 investors, and I let him. He said my little fund would never make a dime. Said it like a joke, like the room was already on his side. And for a few seconds, it was. My name is Grace Whitman. And for most of my life, my father treated me like the one investment he regretted making. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even react the way people expected me to. I just let him finish, because I already knew something he didn't. And so did someone else sitting at that table. Someone who had been quiet the entire night. Watching, listening, waiting. And when he finally stood up, everything in that room changed. Not slowly. Not subtly. All at once. And what he said next is the reason my father never spoke to me the same way again. Stay with me. My father has always been the kind of man who fills a room before he even speaks. Not because he's loud. Because people expect him to be important. And for most of my life, he was. Or at least, that's how everyone treated him. He ran an investment firm in Manhattan. The kind of place where deals happen over quiet conversations and expensive wine. Where people don't raise their voices. Because they don't have to. Everything about him was controlled. His posture. His tone. Even the way he looked at people. Like he was constantly measuring something, deciding where they fit. And for a long time, I thought I understood where I fit too. I was his daughter. That should have meant something. But somewhere along the way, it didn't. Not in the way it was supposed to. I didn't notice it all at once. It wasn't one moment. It was smaller than that. Subtle shifts. Conversations that felt slightly off. Decisions that didn't include me, even when they should have. At first, I told myself it was normal. That I was overthinking it. Because that's what you do when something doesn't make sense. You try to explain it in a way that keeps everything intact. But over time, that explanation stopped working. Because patterns don't stay invisible forever. They repeat. And once they repeat enough, you start seeing them clearly. My father didn't dislike me. That would have been easier to understand. He just didn't take me seriously. Not my choices. Not my ideas. Not the things I cared about. And the strange part is, he never said it directly. Not at first. It showed up in other ways. The way he'd interrupt me mid-sentence. The way he'd smile slightly, like he was humoring me instead of listening. The way he'd redirect conversations toward things he respected. Business, deals, numbers. Like everything else was just background noise. I remember the first time I realized it wasn't going to change. I was 18. I had just been accepted into a program I worked years for. Applied mathematics. Full scholarship. I thought he'd be proud. I actually believed that. I told him over dinner. Explained everything. What it meant. What I wanted to do with it. Where it could lead. And he listened. Quietly. Which, at the time, felt like a good sign. Until he leaned back in his chair and said something that didn't sound harsh at first, but stayed with me longer than anything else. You're thinking too small. That was it. No excitement. No acknowledgement. Just that. I tried to explain more. Tried to show him the bigger picture. But the more I talked, the less interested he looked. Until eventually, he just waved it off. Like the conversation had already ended for him. Come work with me, he said. You'll learn something real. That word stuck. Real. As if everything I had worked toward was. I said no, calmly, not to argue, just to be clear. And something shifted in that moment. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. Because after that, he stopped seeing potential in me. He started seeing a mistake. And the way he treated me after that made it obvious. Not immediately, but consistently. Support turned into distance. Conversations turned into brief check-ins. And slowly, contact became optional. I still showed up. Birthdays, holidays, events where it felt like I was supposed to be there. But every time, it felt more like I was visiting someone else's life. Not part of it. And after a while, I stopped trying to force something that wasn't there. I focused on my own path, my own work, my own way of building something that didn't depend on his approval. Not to prove him wrong. At least, that's what I told myself. But if I'm being honest, a part of me always wanted that moment. The one where he'd look at me differently. Not as someone he tolerated, but as someone he respected. That moment just never came. Instead, there was silence. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that stretches over years without anyone addressing it. We didn't fight. We didn't argue. We just stopped existing in each other's lives. And for a while, that was fine. Because distance makes things easier. It removes the tension, the expectations, the constant reminder that something isn't what it should be. Until something brings it back. In my case, it wasn't a phone call. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even intentional. It was an invitation. Simple, formal, the kind you could ignore without consequence. Except this one came from someone I couldn't ignore. And the moment I saw the name at the bottom, I knew exactly where it was leading. Not just the event, the room, the people, him. For the first time in years, I was about to step back into a space I had already walked away from. Not because I needed to, because I chose to. And that changes everything. Because when you walk into something by choice, you don't go in the same way you left. And the moment I realized whose dinner it actually was, I had a decision to make. Walk away again. Or walk into the one room I knew I wouldn't be welcome in. The invitation sat on my desk for 2 days before I opened it. Not because I didn't know what it was. Because I did. Heavy card stock. Clean typography. The kind of design that doesn't try too hard, because it doesn't have to. It already tells you who it's from. And more importantly, who it's for. I picked it up more than once. Turned it over in my hands. Like maybe the weight of it would change if I looked at it long enough. It didn't. So on the 3rd day, I opened it. Slowly. Not out of hesitation. Out of awareness. Because once I read it, there was no going back to not knowing. Inside, everything was exactly how I expected. Formal. Precise. Carefully worded in a way that made it sound like just another event. A year-end dinner. Private. Limited guests. But what mattered wasn't the wording. It was the name at the bottom. The host. My father. I didn't react right away. Didn't feel anything immediate. No anger. No discomfort. Just recognition. Because this wasn't unexpected. It was inevitable. At some point, our paths were going to cross again. Not emotionally. Not personally. Professionally. In a space where everything is measured differently, where relationships aren't based on history. They're based on value. And for the first time, I knew I was walking into that space on equal ground. Maybe not visibly, but factually. I set the invitation down, looked at it one more time, and asked myself something simple. Do I go? Not because I needed to prove anything, not because I needed closure, just because I could. And that question mattered more than it should have. Because for years, I had avoided places like that. Rooms where I knew I would be judged before I spoke. Where people had already decided who I was, based on what they thought I hadn't become. It was easier not to go. Easier to stay in spaces where none of that existed. Where my work spoke for itself. Where I didn't have to explain anything. But avoidance has a cost. It keeps things quiet, but it doesn't resolve them. And the more I looked at that invitation, the more I realized something. I wasn't avoiding the room. I was avoiding him. Not because I was afraid of what he'd say, but because I already knew. And knowing something in advance doesn't make hearing it easier. It just removes the element of surprise. I picked up my phone, scrolled through my contacts, stopped on a name I hadn't used in years, and then kept scrolling. Because this wasn't a conversation I needed to have. Not with him. Not yet. If I was going to walk into that room, it wasn't going to be on his terms. No preparation. No warning. No controlled setting. Just presence. That was enough. I confirmed my attendance later that afternoon. Short reply. No message. No explanation. Just yes. And once I sent it, everything shifted. Not externally. Internally. Because a decision like that changes how you think about what's coming. It stops being hypothetical. It becomes real. Scheduled. I didn't spend the next few days preparing what to say. There wasn't anything to say. Not yet. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about observation. About stepping into a space and seeing what still existed there. Unfiltered. Unmanaged. And more importantly, how I fit into it now. The night of the dinner came faster than I expected. It always does. Time compresses when something matters. I stood in front of my closet longer than necessary. Not because I didn't know what to wear, but because I knew exactly what I wasn't going to wear. Nothing that signaled anything. No statement pieces. No visible markers of success. Because this wasn't about proving anything visually. The room would take care of that on its own. I chose something simple. Black. Clean lines. Nothing that drew attention. Because attention wasn't something I needed to ask for. If anything, I wanted to control when it happened. And how. I left early. Not rushed. Just deliberate. The city was exactly how it always is that time of year. Busy. Unfocused. Everyone moving towards something that matters only to them. And that contrast made everything clearer. Because whatever was about to happen, it only mattered inside that room. Nowhere else. The building was exactly what I expected. Tall. Glass. Minimal. The kind of place that feels important before you even walk in. I stepped out of the car. Took a second. Not to prepare. To reset. Because once I walked inside, I wasn't stepping into the past. I was stepping into something new. Same people, same dynamics, different position. That's what mattered. I walked through the lobby, up the elevator, watched the numbers change one by one. And with each floor, something else became clearer. This wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about what he thought of me, or what he would say. It was about something much simpler. Presence. The kind you don't announce. You just bring into a room. The elevator doors opened, and the first thing I noticed was the sound. Conversations layered over each other. Glasses. Movement. A room already in motion. I stepped out, paused for half a second, just enough to take it in. And then I walked in. Not quickly, not slowly, just directly. No one noticed me at first, which was exactly what I expected. Because recognition doesn't happen immediately. It builds, gradually, until it becomes unavoidable. I moved through the room, calm, uninterrupted, letting the space adjust around me, without forcing anything. And then it happened. Not dramatically, not all at once. One person looked a little longer than usual. Then another. A pause in conversation. A slight shift in posture. Because familiarity works like that. It doesn't hit instantly. It settles in. Until it clicks. And when it does, it spreads. I didn't look for him. I didn't need to. Because I already knew. The moment he saw me, everything in that room would change. And when our eyes finally met across the room, he didn't look surprised. He looked like he was trying to figure out why I was there at all. I didn't walk toward him. That would have made it obvious. And obvious gives people time to prepare. Instead, I stayed where I was. Let the room move naturally. Watched how conversations formed and shifted. Because in spaces like that, power isn't in what you say first. It's in what you let happen before you speak. I took a glass of water from a passing tray. Didn't touch the champagne. Not because it mattered. Because it gave me something to do with my hands while I waited. And then it happened. Not loudly. Not dramatically. He saw me. His smile stayed in place. But his fingers stopped moving around the glass. He finished his conversation. Didn't rush. Didn't come over immediately. Which told me something important. He was deciding how to approach it. How to frame it. How to stay in control of the situation before stepping into it. That hadn't changed. And it wasn't going to. I didn't move. Didn't signal anything. Because this wasn't about initiating contact. It was about watching how he chose to do it. And eventually, he did. He walked over. Same pace. Same composure. Like this was just another interaction in a room full of them. And when he stopped in front of me, the first thing I noticed was what wasn't there. Recognition. Not real recognition. Not the kind that comes with history. It was surface level. Polite. Professional. The kind you give someone you've met before, but don't actually know. Grace, he said. My name sounded the same. But the way he said it didn't. No warmth. No familiarity. Just acknowledgement. Like he was confirming something, not feeling it. Hello, I said. Simple. Neutral. Because anything more than that would have shifted the tone too early. He looked at me for a second longer than necessary. Not emotionally. analytically, like he was trying to place me in the version of reality he was comfortable with. "I didn't realize you'd be here," he said. There it was. Not a question. A statement, framed casually, but carrying something underneath it. I met his gaze. I was invited. That was enough. No explanation. No context. Just fact. And it landed exactly how I expected. Not confusion. Adjustment. Because now, he had to account for something he hadn't planned for. And in a room like that, unexpected variables matter. He nodded. Slowly. Of course. But it wasn't agreement. It was recovery. The kind of response you give when you don't want to show you're recalculating. "We should talk," he added. Lower tone. More controlled. "Not here." That was predictable. Private setting. Controlled environment. No audience. The same pattern, just applied to a different situation. "I'm here now," I said. No resistance in my voice. No challenge. Just clarity. Because moving the conversation later would have given him time. And time is what turns reactions into strategies. He held my gaze for a moment, long enough to recognize that I wasn't going to shift. Not in this. And for a split second, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not discomfort. Something closer to uncertainty. But it passed quickly, replaced by the same composure he always defaulted to. "Another time then," he said. And just like that, he stepped back. Not physically, strategically. Because he understood something. This wasn't going to unfold the way he expected. And that meant he needed to wait. Reposition. Observe. Which was exactly what I was already doing. The conversation ended there. No escalation. No tension anyone else could point to. Just two people standing in the same space, understanding something without saying it out loud. He moved on. Back into the room. Back into conversations where he knew exactly how to operate. And I stayed where I was. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because saying it now wouldn't have mattered. Not yet. Because timing is what turns a moment into a shift. I let the rest of the room unfold. Watched how people interacted. Who held attention. Who followed it. Because in environments like that, everything is structured around perception, not reality. And perception takes time to change. You don't force it. You let it adjust. Slowly. Until it reaches a point where it can't hold itself together anymore. That's when things actually move. The dinner started soon after. People taking their seats. Conversations narrowing into smaller circles. The room becoming more focused. More contained. Which is exactly what I needed. Because contained spaces make everything clearer. More visible. More defined. And as I walked toward my seat, I realized something. This wasn't about proving anything. Not to him. Not to anyone else in that room. It was about something much simpler. Letting the truth exist. Without interference. Without explanation. Without being adjusted to make anyone more comfortable. And once that happens, everything else follows. And when the dinner actually started, it didn't take long for him to say exactly what I knew he would. Just not in the way anyone else expected. The table was exactly where I expected it to be. Center of the room. Slightly elevated, not physically but socially. The kind of placement that makes it clear who matters, without saying it out loud. Place cards were already set. Names printed cleanly. Precise. Intentional. I found mine without searching, which told me something immediately. This wasn't accidental. Someone had put me here on purpose, not as a guest in the background, but in a position that couldn't be ignored. I took my seat. Calm. No hesitation. And for a moment, everything felt still, like the room was waiting for something to start. People settled in around me. Conversations continued, but quieter now, more focused. Because once everyone is seated, the dynamic changes. It becomes less about movement and more about attention. I didn't look at him right away. Didn't need to. I could feel where he was. Head of the table. Same position he's always held. Same place where everything moves through him. That hadn't changed. And for most people in that room, it never would. Menus were placed down. Drinks refilled. Small details that fill space before something more important happens. And then it did. He stood up, glass in hand. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Just expected. Because this is what he does. He controls the room. With words. With timing. With presence. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he said. Same tone. Same confidence. Nothing about him suggested anything had shifted. Not yet. He moved through the opening smoothly, acknowledging people, referencing the firm, building momentum the way someone does when they've done this 100 times before. And everyone listened, not because they had to, but because they were used to it. This was familiar, predictable, safe, until it was. He started recognizing people individually. Names, positions, contributions, each one placed carefully, each one reinforcing the structure of the room. His wife, his team, people who had earned their place in his version of things. And then, there was a pause. Not long, just enough to notice. Because in that kind of speech, pauses aren't accidental. They're decisions. And I knew what was coming before he said it. I didn't react. Didn't shift. Just waited. "My daughter is here tonight," he said. The words landed lightly, almost casually. But the effect was immediate. Attention shifted. Subtle, but clear. Because now, people were looking. Trying to place me. Connect the name to the face. Understand where I fit into what they thought they knew. He didn't look at me when he said it. Not directly. Which mattered. Because acknowledgement without recognition is a form of distance. And then he continued. "She's always had different ideas." There it was. Not criticism. Not praise. Something in between. Vague enough to sound neutral, but pointed enough to carry meaning. A few people smiled. Light reactions. The kind that follow tone, not content. He took a sip of his drink, set it down, and then said it. The line I already knew was coming. "You'll have to forgive her," he added, almost amused. "She chose a different path." Then he smiled slightly. Not a very profitable one, from what I understand. A few quiet laughs followed. Not because it was funny, because he had given them permission to laugh. Enough to set the tone. Enough to frame me before I said a single word. And that's when I understood something clearly. This wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't emotional. It was deliberate. A controlled moment, placed exactly where it would have the most effect. In front of everyone, without appearing aggressive. That's how he operates. Always has. He continued speaking. Moved on to other things. But the shift had already happened. The room had adjusted. People weren't just listening anymore. They were observing. Looking at me differently. Not directly, but enough to feel it. Questions forming. Assumptions building. All based on a few carefully placed words. I didn't interrupt. Didn't respond. Because reacting in that moment would have done exactly what he wanted. Turned it into something emotional. Something he could control. So I stayed still. Let it sit. Let the perception settle exactly how he shaped it. Because the thing about perception is that once it's established, it becomes much easier to break. Dinner continued. Courses came out. Conversations resumed. But the energy had shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough. Because now, there was context. A story. One version of it. And everyone at that table was operating inside it. For now, I kept my focus narrow. Didn't engage more than necessary. Didn't offer anything extra. Because this wasn't the moment to expand. It was the moment to let things build. And then, it happened again. Not from him this time. From someone else at the table. A question. Casual on the surface. But placed carefully. So what do you do? There it was. Simple. Direct. But loaded. Because now, I wasn't just being framed by him. I was being invited to define myself. Publicly. Inside the version he had just created. And that moment was exactly where everything started to turn. Because when I answered that question, it wasn't just a response. It was the first crack in everything he had just built. The question wasn't aggressive. It wasn't meant to be. That's what made it effective. So what do you do? Simple. Neutral. The kind of thing people ask without thinking. But in that moment, it carried weight. Because of how I had just been introduced. Because of the way the room had already been shaped. Because everyone was now listening, not out of interest, but out of expectation. I looked at the person who asked it, then briefly around the table. Not searching, just acknowledging. And then I answered. I work in finance. That was it. No elaboration. No details. Just enough. And it landed exactly how I expected. A pause. Short. Followed by something subtle. Disappointment. Not obvious. But present. Because that answer didn't match the version of me they had just been given. It didn't challenge it. It didn't confirm it. It just sat there. Incomplete. Which made it easy to interpret. And interpretations tend to follow the loudest voice in the room. In this case, his. Oh, someone else added, leaning slightly forward. What kind of finance? There it was. The second layer. More specific. More focused. Still polite. But now intentional. Because now they wanted clarity. Not for understanding, but for placement. To decide where I fit. Relative to everything else at the table. I didn't rush the answer, didn't fill the space too quickly. Because silence creates attention, and attention makes people listen differently. I run a fund. Again. Simple. Controlled. And again. The reaction followed the same pattern. A pause. Then subtle shifts. A few glances. Quick exchanges of eye contact. Because now the answer had weight. But still no context. And without context, people default to assumption. Small fund. New fund. Something modest. Something that fits comfortably within the version they've already accepted. I could see it. The way their expressions settled. The way the curiosity faded just enough. Like the answer had been processed and placed. Which is exactly what I wanted. Because the more comfortable someone feels in their assumption, the harder it hits when it breaks. He hadn't said anything yet. Which told me something. He was waiting. Letting the room do the work for him. Letting perception build naturally. Before stepping back in to reinforce it. And then, he did. A fund, he repeated lightly. Not questioning. Not impressed. Just echoing it. The way you do when something sounds smaller than it should. What kind of fund? He added. Same tone. Same control. But now the attention was fully back on him. Because when he speaks, people listen differently. Not just for what he says, but for how they're supposed to react to it. I met his gaze. Didn't look away. Didn't shift. Quantitative, I said. One word. Precise. And that word landed differently. Because now, the people who understood it reacted. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But enough. A slight change in posture. A flicker of recognition. Because that wasn't a casual answer anymore. That was specific. Technical. Real. But it still wasn't enough. Not yet. Because information without scale doesn't change perception. And he knew that. That's ambitious, he said, almost amused. There it was. The shift. Subtle. But deliberate. Because now, it wasn't just neutral anymore. It was framed. Not as something established, but as something uncertain. Something trying to become real. But not quite there yet. A few quiet laughs followed. Not loud. Not forced. Just enough to reinforce the tone. And in that moment, the structure was complete. He had acknowledged me, framed me, positioned me, all without saying anything directly negative. That's what makes it effective. Because no one can point to a single line and call it out. But everyone understands what it means. I let it sit. Didn't respond immediately. Because reacting there would have kept me inside his frame. And I wasn't going to do that. Instead, I picked up my glass, took a small sip, set it back down, and said nothing. Which did something unexpected. It created a gap. A space he hadn't accounted for. Because the structure he built relies on response. Agreement. Defense. Something. But silence breaks that flow. And for the first time, I saw it. A slight shift. Not in the room. In him. Because now, he didn't know how far to push it. Without making it obvious. So he stopped. Moved on. redirected the conversation. Just like that. And to anyone watching casually, it looked normal. Just another exchange. Just another moment at a dinner table. But underneath it, something had already changed. Because now the room had two things. His version. And mine. Incomplete. Unresolved. And when those two exist at the same time, something has to happen next. It doesn't stay balanced for long. It tips. And when it does, it doesn't go back. And the moment it finally tipped wasn't when I spoke again. It was when someone else at the table decided to. It didn't happen immediately. That's what made it work. Because if the shift comes too fast, people resist it. They question it. They look for ways to dismiss it. But when it builds quietly, when it settles into the room without forcing itself, it lands differently. Dinner continued. Conversations picked up again. The structure he created held for a moment. People talked, laughed lightly, moved on to safer topics. But something underneath it had already changed. Because now there was uncertainty. Small, subtle, but enough. And uncertainty spreads. Not loudly. Through attention. Through curiosity. Through the quiet realization that something doesn't fully add up. I didn't push it. Didn't expand on anything I said. Because this wasn't about correcting perception directly. It was about letting someone else do it. And eventually, someone did. His name was Julian Mercer. He managed one of the largest institutional portfolios in the room. He had been quiet most of the evening. Not trying to control the room. Not trying to perform. Just observing. The kind of person who doesn't need to speak off. Because when he does, it matters. He set his glass down. Not forcefully. Just enough to signal a shift. And then he looked at me. Not casually. Directly. Which immediately changed the dynamic. Because now, the attention wasn't being guided by my father anymore. It had moved. Naturally. Without permission. I think I know you're firm, he said. Calm. Even. But clear. And that sentence cut through everything. Not because of what it said. Because of who said it. I didn't respond right away. Just met his gaze. Because in moments like that, confirmation matters more when it isn't rushed. He continued. Vivian Wright. The name landed. And this time, the reaction was different. Immediate. Not loud. But visible. Because now, there was context. Real context. Not assumption. Not framing. Recognition. The kind that spreads faster than anything else in a room like that. I nodded once. That's right. And just like that, everything shifted. Not gradually. Not subtly. The structure that had been built minutes earlier started to collapse. Because now, people weren't looking at me through his words. They were looking at me through their own understanding. And those two things didn't match. Someone leaned forward. Another person stopped mid-conversation. Because once a name like that enters the room, it carries weight. Independent of anything anyone else has said. He didn't stop there. Which told me something important. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't curiosity. This was correction. I've seen your performance numbers, he added. Still calm. Still controlled. But I didn't realize. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Because everyone at that table already understood what he meant. He didn't realize it was me. And that gap, that disconnect, was exactly what broke everything open. My father didn't speak immediately. And that silence was louder than anything he had said earlier. Because now, he wasn't in control of the narrative. He was reacting to it. And reaction is not where he operates best. The man across from me continued. Impressive work, he said. Simple. Direct. No exaggeration. Which made it land even harder. Because in that room, validation doesn't come easily. And when it does, people pay attention. The energy shifted again. More noticeably this time. Because now, people were recalculating, repositioning, adjusting their understanding in real time. And that process is impossible to hide. I didn't add anything, didn't expand, because I didn't need to. The moment had already moved. The room was doing the work on its own. My father finally spoke. But when he did, the tone was different. Not dramatically, just slightly. Controlled, but tighter. You never mentioned it, he said. Not accusing. Not questioning. Just placing the responsibility somewhere else. Which was predictable. Because when something shifts unexpectedly, the first instinct is to regain control. Even if it's subtle. I wasn't asked, I said. Same tone. Same control. No escalation. Just fact. And that response landed exactly where it needed to. Because now, it wasn't just about what he said earlier. It was about what he didn't know. And in a room like that, not knowing something important carries weight. More than being wrong. More than being challenged. Because it exposes something deeper. A gap. And gaps change perception quickly. He didn't respond immediately. Didn't push further. Which told me everything. He understood. Not just what had happened, but what it meant. The room continued. Conversations resumed. But nothing felt the same. Because once something like that enters the space, it doesn't leave. It stays. In the background. In every glance. In every interaction that follows. And from that point on, everything he said, everything anyone said, was being filtered through something new. Not his version. Not mine. Reality. And reality doesn't adjust to fit a narrative. It replaces it. And just when it seemed like things might settle, someone else stood up and said something that made everything before it look small. It wasn't planned. At least, it didn't feel like it. Because the kind of moment that changes everything usually doesn't announce itself. It just happens. The conversation had started to settle again. People adjusting. Trying to return to something familiar. Something controlled. Because that's what people do when a room shifts unexpectedly. They try to stabilize it. Pretend it didn't move as much as it did. But that only works for a few seconds. Because once the truth is introduced, it doesn't shrink. It expands. And then, he stood up. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just deliberately. The same man who had spoken earlier. The one who recognized the name. The one who changed everything with a single sentence. Now he had the room again. And this time, everyone knew to listen. He didn't raise his voice, didn't try to command attention. He didn't need to, because attention had already moved to him. "I think it's important to clarify something," he said. Calm, measured, but precise. And that word, clarify, shifted everything instantly. Because clarification doesn't introduce something new. It confirms something that already exists. Which meant this wasn't over. Not even close. He glanced at my father briefly. Not confrontational. Not aggressive. Just acknowledging the space he was about to step into. And then he continued. "Vidian isn't just another fund," he said. In that room, Vidian was not just a company name. It was the kind of name people quietly chased meetings with. And just like that, the room changed again. Because now, we weren't talking about assumption anymore. We were talking about scale. Real scale. The kind that can't be minimized. The kind that exists independently of anyone's opinion. He didn't rush. Didn't stack words. Each sentence came clean. Clear. Unavoidable. "They've outperformed every major index consistently," he added. "And not by small margins." You could feel it. The recalculation happening across the table. Because now people weren't just recognizing the name. They were placing it. Understanding where it actually sits in the hierarchy they operate in. And that matters. More than anything else. He paused briefly. Not for effect. For accuracy. As of last quarter. Another pause. And this one felt different. Because now, everyone knew something definitive was coming. Something measurable. Something that couldn't be reinterpreted. They crossed into the top tier. That was enough. It didn't need to be louder. Didn't need to be exaggerated. Because in that room, that sentence carried weight. More than any introduction. More than any explanation. Because numbers are what people there trust. Not stories. Not impressions. Results. And now, the results were clear. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the room. Which made it land even harder. Because this wasn't about me. It was about what I represented. And how far that was from what had just been implied. My father didn't move. Didn't speak. But the shift was visible. Not dramatic. Not outward. Internal. Because now, he was sitting inside a moment he didn't create. Didn't control. And couldn't redirect. And that's unfamiliar territory for him. Someone across the table leaned forward. Another person adjusted in their seat. Because now, the hierarchy had changed. Not officially, but perceptually. And perception is what drives everything in rooms like that. He finished simply. "Impressive work," he said again. Same words. Different weight now. Because now, everyone understood what they meant. And with that, he sat down. No follow-up. No explanation. Nothing else needed. Because everything that mattered had already been said. Silence followed. Not awkward. Not uncertain. Just still. The kind of silence that comes after something settles into place. Completely. And in that silence, you could feel it. The shift. The collapse of one version of reality. And the emergence of another. No one laughed anymore. No one leaned back casually. No one treated the moment lightly. Because now, they couldn't. My father picked up his glass. Slowly. Not to drink. Just to hold something. Because when control slips, people reach for something familiar. And that was his. He looked at me. For real this time. Not surface level. Not analytical. Something else. Something closer to recognition. Not just of who I was, but of what he had missed. And that's a different kind of realization. Because it doesn't come with a response. It comes with absence. Everything he could have said earlier. Everything he chose to say instead. Now existed in contrast to something undeniable. And contrast is what makes things clear. I didn't react. Didn't shift. Because this wasn't my moment to explain anything. It wasn't my moment to prove anything. That part was already done. The room continued eventually. People adjusting again. But differently this time. More careful. More aware. Because once perception breaks, it doesn't rebuild the same way. It rebuilds around truth. Not assumption. And that changes everything. And just when it seemed like that would be the end of it, he said something else. Not to the room, but directly to me. He didn't speak immediately. That was the first sign something had actually changed. Because normally, he would have quick response, controlled adjustment, a way to bring the room back under his influence. But this time, there was a gap. And in that gap, everything became visible. He set his glass down. Carefully. Like the movement mattered more than usual. Then he looked at me. Not the way he had earlier. Not measured. Not distant. This time, he was actually trying to understand something. And that alone was unfamiliar. Why didn't you tell me? The question came out quieter than I expected. Not defensive. Not aggressive. Just direct. And for a moment, the room faded. Because now, this wasn't about perception anymore. It was about something else. Something personal. I met his gaze. Didn't rush the answer. Because the truth doesn't need to be delivered quickly. It needs to be clear. You never asked. Same tone. Same control. No emotion attached to it. Just fact. And that landed harder than anything else that night. Because it wasn't a response to what just happened. It was a reflection of everything that came before it. Years of it. He looked down for a second. Just a second. But it was enough. Because that kind of movement doesn't come from confusion. It comes from recognition. And recognition is where things start to shift internally. You could have said something, he added. Softer this time. Less certain. Which told me something important. He wasn't trying to control the situation anymore. He was trying to make sense of it. And those are two very different things. I didn't need to, I said. Not dismissive. Not cold. Just honest. Because everything I had built existed independently of his awareness. His acknowledgement wasn't part of the process. And that's what he was realizing now. In real time. The room was quiet. People weren't interrupting. They weren't moving. Because something had shifted again. Not socially. Personally. And that kind of shift holds attention differently. He leaned back slightly. Not relaxed. just adjusting. Like he was trying to find a position that made sense in a moment that didn't. "I would have supported you," he said. And that line almost sounded convincing. If you didn't know the history, if you didn't understand what came before it. But I did. So I didn't respond immediately. Because sometimes the silence after a statement reveals more than the statement itself. He held my gaze, waiting, not for agreement, for acknowledgement, for something that would confirm what he just said had weight. But it didn't. Not anymore. "You had the chance," I said. That was it. No explanation. No examples. No reference to the past. Because we both knew. And when both people know, you don't need to say it out loud. It already exists. That's when something changed again. Subtly, but clearly. The conversation stopped being about the present and became about everything that led up to it. And that's where things get heavier. Because the present can be managed. The past can't. He exhaled slowly, looked away briefly, then back at me. And for the first time that night, there was no control in it. No structure. No framing. Just honesty trying to find its way out. I didn't think. He stopped, mid-sentence, because whatever he was about to say didn't fit anymore, didn't hold up against what had already been exposed. And that's the thing about moments like this. They don't just reveal truth. They remove excuses. He didn't finish the thought, didn't try to replace it, just let it go. And that silence said everything. Because sometimes, what someone can't say is more important than what they can. I picked up my glass, took a small sip, set it back down, not as a gesture, just to break the stillness slightly. Because this wasn't about dragging it out. It wasn't about forcing something deeper. Everything that needed to be understood already had been. The room started moving again. Quietly, carefully, people returning to conversations. But differently now. More aware. More deliberate. Because they had just witnessed something they weren't meant to see. Not the reveal. The shift. Between two people. Where history finally caught up to reality. He didn't try to continue the conversation. Didn't push. Didn't redirect. Because he understood something now. This wasn't something he could fix in a moment. It wasn't something he could control. It wasn't even something he could fully respond to. Without confronting everything behind it. And that's not something he was ready to do. Not here. Not like this. I didn't push either. Because this wasn't about resolution. It wasn't about closure. It was about clarity. And clarity had already been achieved. Everything else would have to happen somewhere else. At another time. If it happened at all. And when the dinner finally ended. What happened after, outside that room, mattered more than anything that was said inside it. The dinner didn't end all at once. It never does. Not in rooms like that. People don't stand up and announce it. They leave gradually. One conversation at a time. One excuse at a time. Until what was once full feels empty without anyone saying why. I stayed where I was for a few minutes. Not because I had something left to say, but because leaving too quickly would have turned it into a reaction. And this wasn't that. I wasn't leaving because of what happened. I was leaving because I was done. There's a difference. I picked up my glass, finished the last sip, set it down exactly where it had been. Small things like that matter. They signal control. Even when everything else has shifted, people started approaching me. Not all at once. Carefully. Individually. The same people who had been quiet earlier now had questions. Different tone. Different posture. Because now, they weren't trying to place me. They were trying to understand. And that shift was obvious. Impressive work, someone said. Didn't realize that was you. Another asked about the fund. Performance. Strategy. Not out of politeness. Out of interest. Real interest. The kind that only shows up when perception changes. I answered briefly. Not expanding too much. Not pulling away either. Because this wasn't the moment to build anything new. It was just acknowledgement of what already existed. He didn't come back to me. Not again. And that told me everything. Because if he had something to say, he would have said it. The fact that he did meant he understood the situation clearly. More clearly than he wanted to. I stood up eventually. No announcement. No final interaction. Just movement. I walked through the room the same way I entered it. Calm. Unrushed. But this time, people noticed. Not because I asked them to. Because now, they knew. And recognition changes how presence is felt. I reached the exit. Paused for a second. Not out of hesitation. Just to take in the space one last time. Because something had shifted there. Not the room itself. What it represented. And once something shifts like that, it doesn't go back. I stepped outside. The air felt different immediately. Cooler. Quieter. Not because the city had changed, but because the environment I had just left no longer existed for me in the same way. I walked without direction for a minute. Let the movement settle things. Because moments like that don't hit all at once. They unfold. Gradually. Piece by piece. I didn't feel what I expected. No rush. No release. No sense of victory. Just clarity. The kind that doesn't need to be confirmed. It just sits there. Steady. I stopped near the corner. Looked at my reflection briefly in a dark window. Same face. Same expression. But different context. Because the version of me that used to walk into rooms like that was gone. Not replaced. Just no longer relevant. My phone buzzed. I already knew who it was before I looked. I didn't answer immediately. Not out of avoidance. Just consideration. Because conversations like that don't happen casually. Not after something like this. I let it ring once more. Then picked up. Hi. There was a pause on the other end. Not long. Just enough to register. And then his voice. Quieter than I had ever heard it. Are you still nearby? Simple question. But it carried something underneath it. Not control. Not expectation. Something closer to uncertainty. And that alone told me more than anything he could have said directly. I'm outside, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. Because now, the next step wasn't structured. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something either of us had prepared for. I'd like to talk, he said. And this time, it wasn't framed. Not positioned. Not controlled. Just direct. Which made it different. But not enough. Not yet. I looked down the street. People passing. Cars moving. Everything continuing the way it always does. Because moments like this only matter to the people inside them. No, I said. Calm. Not cold. Just clear. Not because I didn't want to talk. Because this wasn't the place for it. And more importantly, not the time. Another pause. And in that silence, I could feel it. The realization that this wasn't something he could fix immediately. That whatever came next would have to happen differently. I understand, he said. And I believed him. Because for the first time, he wasn't trying to adjust the situation. He was accepting it. We didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else to say. Not now. I ended the call, put my phone away, and kept walking. Not away from him. Not toward anything specific. Just forward. Because that's what happens after moments like that. The days after that night were quiet. No dramatic apology. No sudden chain. No perfect father-daughter moment. Just a message from him a few days later. Can we talk? I read it twice. For years, those words would have meant everything to me. They would have felt like proof that he finally wanted to see me. But this time, they didn't control me. I replied later that evening. Not yet. Because the conversation he wanted to have required more than one emotional night. It required consistency. And consistency can't be proven at a dinner table. Months passed. He reached out again. Not with speeches. Not with control. Just presence. And slowly, something changed. Not the past. That stayed exactly where it was. What changed was me. I stopped waiting for him to become proud of me before I allowed myself to feel proud of myself. That was the real shift. Because at the end of the day, this was never about winning. It was never about embarrassing him in front of investors. And it was never about making him regret what he said. It was about knowing who I was, without needing him to confirm it. Because sometimes the moment that changes everything isn't the one where people finally see you. It's the one where you realize you don't need them to.